The glass isn't shaking, the hand holding it is. It's 1958, a Hollywood Hills mansion, the kind of party where careers are made and destroyed between the appetizers and dessert. Marlon Brando is standing in the center of the room. His shirt is half unbuttoned. His eyes are burning with that famous intensity, the intensity that won him an Oscar. The intensity that terrified directors. The intensity that made grown men look away. He's pointing at Dean Martin. "You," Brando says, his voice cutting through the jazz and the laughter, "are everything that's wrong with this industry." The room goes silent. 43 people, studio heads, starlets, writers, directors, all of them frozen, all of them holding their breath because Marlon Brando has just challenged the king of cool. And Dean Martin is smiling. Not a nervous smile, not a defensive smile. The smile of a man who's been waiting for this moment. What Dean whispered next would be quoted in Hollywood for the next 50 years. But before we get to those 6 words, you need to understand why Marlon Brando hated Dean Martin and why Dean Martin didn't care. To understand what happened that night, you have to understand the war that was tearing Hollywood apart in 1958. On one side, the method. Marlon Brando, James Dean, Montgomery Clift. They didn't act, they became. They dug into their souls, pulled out their darkest memories, and bled on camera. Brando would stay in character for weeks. He would refuse to memorize lines, forcing directors to hide cue cards around the set. He would gain weight, lose weight, transform his body and mind until he wasn't Marlon Brando anymore. He was the character. The critics called it genius. The actors' studio called it revolution. Hollywood called it the future. On the other side, the old guard, Cary Grant, Clark Gable, and Dean Martin. They didn't dig, they didn't suffer, they didn't bleed. They showed up, hit their marks, said their lines, and went home. Dean was the poster child for this approach. He famously refused to rehearse. 1 take, maybe 2, and then the golf course. Directors who asked for more were told politely but firmly to find another actor. Dean had learned something in Steubenville that Brando never understood. In the steel mills and the gambling dens of Ohio, you didn't survive by showing people your soul. You survived by hiding it. The mask wasn't weakness. The mask was armor. Marcus Webb was a junior publicist at Paramount, 26 years old. He had been sent to the party to keep an eye on the talent. He would spend the next 40 years keeping his mouth shut about what he saw until now. But Marcus didn't know what was coming. None of them did because Marlon Brando had been drinking since noon, and he had decided that tonight he would teach Dean Martin a lesson about art. The party was at the home of a studio executive whose name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is who was there. Frank Sinatra holding court by the piano, a cigarette between his fingers, his laugh cutting through the crowd like a blade. He was watching Brando with those cold blue eyes, watching and waiting. Sammy Davis Jr. making everyone laugh. His energy filling every corner of the room. But even Sammy had noticed the tension. Even Sammy had stopped mid-joke when Brando started moving. Natalie Wood, young, beautiful, watching everything with those dark eyes that missed nothing. She would later say she knew something was coming. She just didn't know what. And Dean Martin leaning against the bar, a glass of what everyone assumed was bourbon in his hand. His tie was loose. His posture was relaxed. He looked like a man without a care in the world. It was apple juice. But nobody knew that yet. Brando had been watching Dean all night, watching him tell jokes, watching him charm the women, watching him make everyone laugh without breaking a sweat, watching him do absolutely nothing that resembled work. It infuriated him. Brando had spent 3 months preparing for his last role. He had starved himself. He had studied. He had suffered. He had lived as the character, breathed as the character, dreamed as the character. And Dean Martin had just waltzed onto the set of Some Came Running, improvised half his scenes, and gotten better reviews. The critics called Dean effortlessly magnetic. They called Brando intense. Brando didn't want to be intense. He wanted to be magnetic, but he didn't know how. He couldn't figure it out. He couldn't understand how a man who didn't try could outshine a man who gave everything. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. It wasn't supposed to work that way. Brando pushed through the crowd. People parted for him. They always did. His shoulders were tense. His jaw was tight. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides. He stopped 3 feet from Dean. "I've been watching you," Brando said. Dean took a sip from his glass. Slow, deliberate. "A lot of people do, pal. You're not an actor." The jazz kept playing, but everyone within earshot had stopped talking, stopped moving, stopped breathing. You're a crooner who got lucky. You memorize lines. You hit marks, but you don't feel anything. You don't become anyone. You're empty. Dean didn't move. Didn't flinch, didn't put down his drink. His jaw didn't tighten. His shoulders didn't tense. His eyes didn't waver. He just waited. Brando had fame. He had Oscars. He had the respect of every serious actor in Hollywood. But he had made one mistake. He had challenged Dean Martin to a fight he couldn't win. Because you can't hurt a man who doesn't care what you think. What happened next took less than a minute, but it would be whispered about for decades. The room held its breath. Marcus Webb would later say he could hear his own heartbeat. 43 people silent, watching. The clink of ice cubes. The distant murmur of the jazz trio now playing softer as if they sensed something was happening. The smell of expensive perfume and cigarette smoke hanging in the air. Do you know what acting is? Brando continued, his voice rising. It's truth. It's pulling your guts out and showing them to the world. It's feeling every emotion until it destroys you. He stepped closer. Close enough that Dean could smell the whiskey on his breath. Close enough to see the veins pulsing in Brando's neck. What do you feel, Dean, when you're up there on that stage pretending to be drunk, singing your little songs? What do you feel? Dean didn't step back, didn't blink, didn't move a single muscle. I feel, Dean said slowly, like I won another drink. A few nervous laughs scattered, uncertain. Brando's face darkened. That's exactly what I mean. You're a fraud. You're not an artist. You're a nightclub act with a movie contract. The words hung in the air like smoke. Brando waited for the flinch. Waited for the crack in the armor. Waited for Dean to show something, anything that proved he was human. Nothing. Dean paused for a moment. He looked past Brando, past the crowd, past the chandeliers and the champagne glasses and the frightened faces of studio executives who were already calculating the damage control. He looked at something only he could see, something far away, something that had nothing to do with this room, this party, this man standing in front of him demanding answers. Maybe he was thinking about Steubenville. Maybe he was thinking about the steel mills and the cold Ohio winters. Maybe he wasn't thinking about anything at all. And then Dean looked at his glass, the amber liquid, the ice cubes melting slowly, the condensation running down the side like tears. He held it up to the light for a moment, watching the way the chandelier sparkled through it. He swirled it once, twice, and then he spoke. Marlon, Dean whispered loud enough for everyone to hear. I don't act. He took a sip. I show up. 43 seconds. That's how long the silence lasted. Marcus Webb counted. He counted every single one. 43 seconds of Marlon Brando trying to find a response. 43 seconds of Hollywood's greatest method actor realizing he had been beaten by a man who didn't even consider himself an actor. 43 seconds of Dean Martin just standing there smiling. That same lazy, effortless smile. Brando opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Nothing came out. The man who could become anyone had become nothing. The man who could feel everything felt something he hadn't felt in years. Defeat. His hands trembled. His eyes lost that famous intensity. The fire that had burned so bright just moments ago was gone. Put out. He looked for the first time in his career like a man who didn't know his next line. Marcus Webb watched Brando turn away, watched him push through the crowd, watched him disappear into the night without saying a word to anyone. And he watched Dean Martin do something extraordinary. He ordered another drink, as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just humiliated the greatest actor of his generation with 6 words, as if the last 5 minutes had been nothing more than a mild interruption. Same thing, pal, Dean said to the bartender. His voice was calm, relaxed, almost bored, and the party continued. Brando left the party without saying goodbye. His driver found him sitting on the curb outside, staring at the stars. His jacket was wrinkled. His hair was a mess. He looked like a man who had just lost a fight he didn't know he was in. Take me home, Brando said. He didn't speak for the entire drive. Didn't move. Didn't blink, just sat there in the darkness replaying those 6 words in his head over and over and over. I don't act. I show up. By the next morning, everyone knew. Hollywood is a small town with a big mouth. The story spread through the studios like wildfire. By noon, it had reached New York. By evening, it was the only thing anyone was talking about. Some said Dean had won. Some said Brando had been drunk and it didn't count. Some said it was the greatest moment in Hollywood party history. What nobody disputed was the line, "I don't act, I show up." It became a mantra, a philosophy, a middle finger to everyone who thought art required suffering. Years passed. Dean kept making movies, kept hosting his TV show, kept pretending to be drunk while drinking apple juice, kept making it look easy. Brando kept winning awards, kept transforming, kept suffering for his art, kept searching for something he couldn't name. They never spoke again. You might think that's where the story ends. Two different philosophies, two different lives, two men who went their separate ways. But there's one more chapter, one more twist that changes everything. In 1994, Marlon Brando gave an interview to a journalist named Peter Manso for a biography. It was a long interview, rambling, confessional, the kind of interview you give when you're old and tired and don't care what anyone thinks anymore. And buried in the middle, Brando said something he had never said publicly. "Dean Martin," Brando whispered. "He understood something I never did." The journalist leaned closer. "What do you mean?" Brando paused. His eyes were distant, lost in a memory from 36 years ago. "He never tried. He never prepared. He never suffered. And yet when you watched him on screen, you believed him. You loved him. You couldn't take your eyes off him." Brando's voice cracked. "I spent my whole life learning how to act. Dean Martin spent his whole life learning how to be. And in the end, he was more real than I ever was." Marcus Webb heard about the interview years later. He was retired by then, living in Palm Springs, 72 years old, still sharp, still remembering. He laughed when he read it. "I knew," Marcus said. "I knew that night in 1958 when Brando walked away and Dean ordered another drink. I knew who had won." How? Because Dean didn't need to win. He didn't need anything from anyone. That's why he was untouchable. You can't beat a man who isn't fighting. Dean Martin died on Christmas Day 1995. He was 78 years old. Marlon Brando died in 2004. He was 80. By the time they were both gone, Hollywood had changed. Method acting wasn't revolutionary anymore. It was expected. Every young actor starved themselves for roles, stayed in character, suffered. But something was lost. We all know actors who disappear into their roles. We admire their dedication, their commitment, their pain. But when was the last time we saw someone who made it look easy? Who walked onto a screen and made us smile without understanding why? Dean Martin had that gift, the gift of effortlessness. He learned it in Steubenville. In the bars where a young Dino Crocetti sang for tips. In the boxing rings where he learned to take a punch without flinching. In the steel mills where he learned that showing weakness meant losing everything. He learned that the world doesn't reward suffering. The world rewards survival. And survival means never letting them see you sweat. Brando made 40 films, won 2 Oscars, died alone, overweight, estranged from his children, bitter about an industry that had moved on. Dean made 51 films, never won an Oscar, died surrounded by family, loved by millions, at peace with who he was. We all think we need to suffer for our art. We all think pain equals authenticity. We all think the harder we try, the better we'll be. Dean Martin proved us wrong. Sometimes the most profound thing you can do is make it look easy. Sometimes the greatest performance is the one that doesn't look like a performance at all. The glass. That's what Marcus Webb remembered most. Not the words, not Brando's face, not the silence, the glass in Dean's hand. Steady, unshaken, while everyone else in the room was trembling. "That's when I knew," Marcus said. The secret to Dean Martin wasn't talent. It wasn't luck. It was the glass. He held on to something while everyone else was falling apart. And he never let anyone see what was really inside. Remember that night in 1958? Remember Marlon Brando, the greatest actor of his generation, speechless? Remember Dean Martin, the man who didn't act, winning without trying. And remember those 6 words, "I don't act, I show up." That's the secret. That's the legacy. That's the lesson. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply show up and let them wonder how you make it look so easy.